8. World War II tank. World War II ended nearly 80 years ago, yet weapons and vehicles from the conflict are still being found in places that saw heavy combat. In 2016, divers discovered a Soviet-made T-34 tank sitting at the bottom of the Don River in southwestern Russia. The submerged vehicle was found in Voronezh Oblast and may have been in transport after being manufactured at the Stalingrad tractor plant, which was converted for military production during the war. While it's unclear how the tank ended up in a river at about 23 feet below the surface, there's been speculation that it may have fallen off a temporary bridge. Using an armored vehicle, the Russian military removed the 33-ton machine, which proved to be a rather difficult feat. It was visibly aged, but in surprisingly good condition. A military spokesperson announced plans to restore the tank and put it on display at Patriot Park in Moscow Oblast. The length of the project would depend on whether the vehicle was restored externally or if it was restored to running condition. In addition to the tank, the divers found an array of other World War II artifacts, including pontoons, transport vehicles, and small vessels. Just a handful of years earlier, in 2011, a team removed a 50-ton KV-1 tank from the Neva River near St. Petersburg. It sank during the 872-day siege of Leningrad, which was one of the longest and deadliest sieges in history. No human remains were found in the tank, indicating that its crew managed to escape before it sank. Like the T-34 discovered in Voronezh, it may have fallen off a pontoon bridge. At the time of its removal, experts said they planned to restore it and put it on display at the Museum of the Battle for Leningrad. What would you do if you stumbled upon an operational tank that seemed to be abandoned? Let us know down below, and while you're at it, hit that subscribe button. 7. Russian tank graveyards in Ukraine. In early May of 2022, less than 3 months after Russia invaded Ukraine, reporters from the Daily Mail discovered a military equipment graveyard filled with hundreds of charred tanks and armored vehicles in Bucha, roughly 20 miles outside Kiev. At the time, Putin was proudly parading Russian military tanks in Moscow's Red Square. But Ukraine had put up a much harder fight than expected and had managed to push back Putin's troops after a drawn-out battle in the region. By that point, the Ukrainian military estimated that it had destroyed 1,145 Russian tanks and 2,764 armored vehicles. Most of the machines at Bucha were clearly damaged beyond use. Images show the vehicles in an obvious state of disrepair, with many covered in rust and missing their tracks and other essential parts. Tank graveyards have popped up in other places throughout Ukraine, including outside the country's second-largest city, Kharkiv, which sits along the Russian border. Photos that began circulating just months after the invasion showed a growing collection of destroyed tanks piled up on top of one another. Meanwhile, abandoned tanks began to line the roadsides outside Kiev and elsewhere. Also working to Ukraine's advantage was a so-called jack-in-the-box design flaw in many Russian tanks, which made their entire ammunition store vulnerable to exploding from an incoming anti-tank round. As a result, in many cases, all it took was one shot to blow the turret off a Russian tank. In early 2023, the open-source monitoring group Oryx confirmed that at least 1,000 Russian tanks had been destroyed, while 544 or more had been captured. 79 were damaged and 65 were abandoned. The count only included tanks that the group was able to visually confirm, so it's likely that the actual numbers are much higher, possibly as high as 2,000, according to military analyst Jacob Janovsky, who told CNN that Russia began the war with around 3,000 operational tanks. That means there's a good chance that Russia has lost at least half of its initial supply. Janovsky also estimates that Ukraine has captured nearly 100 more tanks than it has lost, suggesting that the country may be leading the war when it comes to tank warfare. 6. Fort Knox Tank Graveyard. The Fort Knox U.S. Army base in Kentucky is famously known for being home to the United States Bullion Depository, where a large portion of the country's gold reserves are stored. But the sprawling 170-square-mile property contains a lesser-known yet equally fascinating tank graveyard filled with various types of tanks that have clearly been sitting in place for a very long time. Starting in 1940, the base was home to the U.S. Army's Armor School, where M1 tank crews trained. There was also a large firing range filled with old tanks that were used as targets. When the school relocated to Fort Benning, Georgia in 2010, after 71 years of operating at Fort Knox, the shooting range fell out of use and the tanks were simply left behind. In 2022, a group of explorers who run a YouTube channel called Ruin Road obtained permission to explore the site. The footage they captured revealed an array of tanks, including a Cold War-era M60A2 Starship. Built during the 1970s, the model was one of the most technologically complex tanks ever built. But it was largely a failure due to the complexities of operating and maintaining it. Most starships were converted into M60A3s, so it's rare to cross paths with one. The graveyard is also home to a rare M103 heavy tank. Only 300 were ever made between its introduction in 1957 and its withdrawal from service in 1974. There's also an M47, at least 2 M60A3s, and much more. Unfortunately, the tank graveyard isn't typically open to the public. An entry in the Erie, Indiana blog from 2013 states that the base opens its restricted areas to visitors. However, it's unclear whether this is still the case. 5. Falaka Island. Located in the Persian Gulf, roughly 12.5 miles off the coast of Kuwait City, Falaka Island was once home to around 2,000 residents. In the island's northwestern region was the village of Al-Zor, which was the longest continuously inhabited location in the country until the Iraqi invasion of 1990 and 1991. Everyone living on Falaka Island fled to the mainland during the invasion, and most of them never returned, leaving behind bullet-riddled homes, businesses, mosques, and other buildings. The structures that weren't destroyed remain standing to this day. They're filled with furniture, decorations, and other personal belongings of the families that left them behind, and they appear as if someone could walk in the door any minute. And yet they're clearly abandoned, giving the old village an eerie sense of being frozen in time. In another part of the island, there's a military equipment graveyard filled with tanks and other vehicles that the Iraqi forces left behind when they fled the island. Many are visibly mangled and falling apart, while others are still in one piece but still display noticeable wear and tear. It's clear that they've been sitting there for a while and that something terribly violent happened in the past. Falaka Island has become a tourist destination in recent years, offering boat trips and overnight stays, and some cafes have opened up to accommodate visitors. There are proposals to further develop the island for tourism, but some people would prefer for it to remain its current atmosphere of peace and quiet. 4. The Sao Paulo. The 870-foot-long aircraft carrier Sao Paulo was built during the late 1950s in France and was later sold to the Brazilian Navy in the year 2000. It was decommissioned in 2017, and in 2021, the ship was sold to a Turkish scrapyard. However, Turkey canceled the carrier's permission to enter in August of 2022 after Brazilian authorities failed to procure documentation about the amount of hazardous asbestos the ship contained. No other country wanted anything to do with the Sao Paulo, so it returned to Brazil, where it was denied entry into its own country. The Navy turned the vessel away from its bases, but refused to say why, and as a result, the ship returned out to sea with a tug, where it spent months sailing aimlessly in circles, wastefully consuming fuel. In early 2023, the Brazilian Navy declared its plan to scuttle the Sao Paulo at sea despite being laden with high amounts of hazardous asbestos and other chemicals. The decision came after a judge rejected the injections of environmentally conscious politicians. According to the Navy, the ship had holes in its hull and would inevitably sink anyway, giving them no other choice than to scuttle it. The plan commenced despite last-minute attempts to stop it by Brazil's legal system. Offers from a Saudi company to buy the ship were also turned down. Then, on February 3rd, the Sao Paulo slipped beneath the waves in international waters. Many have accused Brazilian authorities of shirking their responsibility to safely dispose of the ship, and the controversy is ongoing. 3. HMAS Otama. Built in Scotland during the 1970s, the HMAS Otama was an Oberon-class submarine of the Royal Australian Navy. It was the last of its class to enter service upon being commissioned in 1978. Tasked with gathering intelligence on the Soviet Pacific Fleet and Chinese naval vessels, the 295-foot-long sub routinely conducted classified coastal surveillance missions throughout Asia during the Cold War, including off the coasts of Vietnam, China, India, and Indonesia. It was one of two so-called mystery boats in its class that were fitted with special spying equipment. Despite its accomplishments and reliability, the Otama wasn't able to entirely avoid tragedy. In 1987, 2 crew members on the submarine died when the vessel submerged while they were working in the fin. Otama remained in service longer than originally planned due to some issues with the Collins-class submarines that would replace the Oberon-class vessels. But in late 2000, it was finally decommissioned. For years after that, the rusting Otama languished at port. Initial plans to turn the retired sub into a floating museum never went through due to repeated rejections for various location proposals by the country's Department of Sustainability and Environment. In 2008, the Otama was listed for sale on eBay, but unfortunately, it failed to sell. Most recently, plans to turn it into a museum were reconsidered, but it seemed as though the project's planners ran into one problem after another. Funding for mooring cables that the ship needed to withstand winter storms fell short. However, fundraising efforts helped to secure enough money to fix the Otama's moorings. But the possibility of scrapping the vessel wasn't completely off the table. Then, in 2021, the submarine began to list and was in danger of capsizing. The following year, the decision was finally made to scrap the Otama, which had failed to garner the support it needed for preservation. In late 2022, the sub was towed to Western Australia to be broken apart. 2. Panzer wrecks in Bulgaria. When World War II ended, Bulgaria smelted down most of the Panzer tanks it had received from Nazi Germany after pledging its support to the Axis powers. But around 40 of them were partially buried along the Warsaw Pact signatories' southeastern border as defensive positions in case NATO forces attacked. Following the Turkish invasion of Cyprus in 1974, a second line of about 100 Soviet-issued T-34 tanks was added to the existing defenses, known as the Crawley-Marco line. After that, the tanks were pretty much forgotten about until 2007, when one of them was dug up and stolen in Bulgaria's Lesovo region. Unfortunately, the stolen tank was never found, and its disappearance sparked a frenzied government effort to rescue the partially buried tanks before more thieves could get to them. It quickly became apparent that looters had stripped many of the vehicles of their guns, hatches, and turrets for scrap. The Bulgarian army also recovered several extremely rare tanks with estimated values in the millions, including one of just 6 surviving Jagd Panzer IV L-48 models that exist throughout the world. But some of those involved in the effort doubted the value of the rare tanks due to the extent of the damage that was left behind by vandals. At first, the government planned to auction them off, but they changed their minds and instead decided to keep the tanks. As of 2015, 7 or 8 of the tanks were on display at the Museum of Battle Glory in Yambol, while the rest remained in storage awaiting restoration. 1. Minsk. The 896-foot-long aircraft carrier Minsk entered service with the Soviet Navy in 1978. She was decommissioned in 1994 after getting into a serious accident that Russian authorities remain suspiciously quiet about to this day. A Korean company bought the ship with plans to scrap it, but environmental protesters stopped the plan from following through, and the Minsk was instead towed to China. A group of video game arcade owners fought to save the carrier and ended up buying it for $4.3 million. They turned it into a military theme park called Minsk World, which officially opened in the year 2000. The Minsk changed hands several times over the following years before ending up in the ownership of a Chinese real estate company. Minsk World eventually closed in 2016, but sometime in 2017 or 2018, Minsk was towed to a location near Shanghai with plans to renovate it and reopen the park. Unfortunately, though, that never happened. These plans were met with unexplained delays, and the mysteriously abandoned vessel continues to languish in the harbor with no clear plans for the future. Would you rather have the opportunity to drive a tank or blow one up with a rocket launcher if given the chance? Let us know what you think in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye.